Thanks for the introduction, and I'll introduce the other panel members for us in a second, but happy to be with you here. Today, the global sustainability community, as you know, is coming together for this 24 hours, an important 24 hours, to explore humanity's biggest shared challenges, whilst raising, hopefully, vital funds for the local NGOs in the Ukraine that are being devastated by the war. I want to thank you, Chris, for having taken that initiative with GlobeScan. More important now than ever. We will explore in this hour the global food system. The war in the Ukraine is fast-tracking food up the global agenda, there's no doubt about it, having exposed the fragility of our food system even more. And I would argue a system that is fast approaching collapse. Unless the food and land systems are transformed over the next 10 years, i.e. we don't have too much time, the Sustainable Development Goals as well as the Paris Agreement to keep climate change below 1.5 degrees will be out of reach. It's absolutely a vital component to reach those two agreements. More and more we now realize that our food system, frankly, is broken, responsible for around 30% of the global greenhouse gases, 70% of fresh water use, 80% of tropical deforestation, and obviously enormous habitat loss that comes with it. We rapidly see the risk actually becoming, the food system becoming probably one of the biggest emitters of carbon with the rate we are going. And there's also the human element that we don't have to talk too much about, but the poor livelihoods of farmers that we find in the food system, the stunting that is there, the people going to bed hungry, and frankly, a system where about 1 billion people are undernourished, 3 billion people are malnourished. It's about half of the world population. We can find that, we can call that a system that is frankly in equilibrium. Enormous destructional effects of climate change and planetary boundaries are actually at a cost that is twice as much as we pay for food. Systemic, the global organization driving systemic change, is estimating that we have 12 trillion negative cost for food. It's also an enormous opportunity because if we can turn this around, it becomes a significant positive contribution. And this is what we need to strive for, and this is what this panel is going to explore. Changing the way we produce, we consume, and it's more than needed now in the wake of rebuilding back after the COVID. Getting it right will contribute to improvements around many dimensions, in my opinion. Reversing climate change and biodiversity loss, soil and water health, but also the improvement of nutrition and public health, and yes, equally importantly, the food security and the reduction in poverty that we will be talking about. If we can transform our food system to a regenerative, sustainable agricultural system, we will likely be able to feed the 9 billion people of this world and actually do that within the planetary boundaries. Now, with Russia and the Ukraine together being responsible for about 30% of the global wheat trade alone, the war in the Ukraine has certainly exacerbated the food crisis. There's no question about it. But the crisis was already there before the terrible war. It has definitely brought to light the fragilities and the failures even more so, and hopefully help people get into faster action to fix this system. Not a day too soon, if we may be honest. What we like to focus on here in this session is not really spending too much time on admiring the problem, but discussing with our distinguished panel the solutions that we have. Solutions grounded in optimism. It frankly is too late to be pessimist, and we don't have a choice. We'll also talk the elephants in the room of what is truly needed, from looking at the biofuels or changing to plant-based diets, or looking at the roles that international organizations can play, like the WTO, and yes, even the issues of GMO. We will do this round in 3 segments, if you want to. The first one, we'll talk briefly about the barriers and opportunities that we face in our food system. Then we move to how we can mobilize all the stakeholders for change. And then finally, how do we create the transformative partnerships and the advocacy that is needed to drive the deeper and broader systems changes. We have the brief interventions of our panel members, but I also encourage you, audience, to ask the questions in your chat rooms that we will hopefully have enough time for to respond as well. With those reflections, let me just introduce the incredible panel that we have. Let me start with Earthren Cousins, led the World Food Program for many years. That's how I got to know her. She is a distinguished fellow of the Global Food and Agriculture at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and also the founder and CEO of Food Systems for the Future. We have Agnes Kalibata, that many of you know. Agnes is the president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, and she also served as the UN Secretary General's special envoy to the successful 2021 Food Systems Summit that we just finished. And then finally, we have an incredible leader and businessman with Sven Tora Holsetter here. Sven is the CEO of Yara International, one of the world's leading producers of fertilizer and agricultural solutions, and equally active in the Food Summit, Agra, or in the response that is being put together to the Ukrainian crisis. So with that, let me dive in to the first part of the section that we do for about 15 minutes to really discuss the barriers and opportunities that we now see in our food system. The biggest disruptions that we have, but more importantly, the solutions and the opportunities that we need to concentrate on. With that, let me ask Earthren if you can kick it off.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to the organizers and you for including me in this very, very important conversation. And as you noted, our food system was challenged even before the Russian invasion into Ukraine. But because this is about raising money for Ukraine, I think we must acknowledge and note that the impact of the Russian invasion on the ag and food system in Ukraine and how that affects the balance of the world. And right now, the Kiev School of Economics tells us that there's been $4.3 billion in damage to Ukraine's agriculture. That the Russian invasion has affected Ukraine's ability to export agricultural products that would feed 400 million people. And I start there because when we talk about humanitarian response, WFP, the organization that you noted I led, purchases about 50% of their wheat commodities from Ukraine. And as a result of the invasion, not only is that grain no longer available, the price of grain for humanitarian response has almost doubled for the WFP in providing the access to the food that they need to feed those who are impacted by the system, but impacted by hunger. Now, you said it, Paul. We had COVID. We have climate, now have conflict, we have high gas prices, and you have a significant number of countries that, because of their health responses in COVID, lack the access to the financial resources that are necessary to support their ability to meet both the subsidy needs of their farmers and the social safety net needs of their populations. So where we began this year with about 193 million people who were acutely hungry, our challenge and what we are unfortunately projecting is something between 445 million and 100 million additional people acutely hungry by the end of 2022. Now, why doesn't our system address this? You ask, what are those barriers? It's not enough just to provide people with food and cash, which the humanitarian system does a great job of, but we need to ensure that we provide the capital that is necessary for organizations like WFP and the other NGOs to support the immediate humanitarian assistance that is necessary. But the other challenges include the fact that because of the divide between our humanitarian and development systems, we can't provide what I call preemptive humanitarian response, providing the seeds and tools and fertilizer that I'm sure Sven will talk about to those smallholder farmers to fill the gaps in the global food system with increased production at the local level. It's not happening. We also have the challenge of the inability for the World Trade Organization. You asked, what is the role of the World Trade Organization? We need WTO to ensure that countries that are net exporting countries during this period do not implement trade embargoes or other trade affecting activities. Why? Because when they do, in order to protect with the goal of protecting their smallholder farmers, what happens is that it increases even further the prices for net importing countries, those countries, as we've just discussed, that are highly vulnerable as we speak today. So the barriers of trade, the barriers of the humanitarian development divide on how we provide assistance, as well as the ongoing challenges that were affecting so many before this conflict began. Paul, you're on mute.
Turning right away to Agnes, who has led the Global Food Summit and rallying probably more people together to look at the longer term structural issues that we need to address in our food system, i.e. these enormous opportunities that we have to turn this costs into a benefit. It might be good, Agnes, to focus on some of the longer term structural changes that we need to make to have it work for everybody.
Thank you, Paul, for having me on this program. And I'm calling you from the Commonwealth meeting here in Kigali. So I hope that the noise is not too destructive. But listen, I really appreciate you doing this and everybody else who is doing this, because like I said, I've told all of you and the global community generally is, I grew up in a situation similar to probably what many Ukrainians are going through today, where one day you have a decent home and a family, another day you have nothing, another day you can't feed your children. You're a professional who has zero capability to feed your children. So what kept us going and what saw us through was the world coming through, whether it was what the UN system does, whether it was what we here from a humanitarian perspective can get to do. But what was most important and what got me to this stage where I'm at today is that we invested in long-term, we got long-term investment, whether it was UNHCR buying us land and making sure that my family and I had land in which they can grow, on which they could grow food, or whether it was the fact that once they got this land, they could have access to seeds and fertilizers, like Catherine has been saying. So it's really, really important that we look and find opportunities that can start building livelihoods. Being a refugee does not mean that you don't have a livelihood. Being displaced in your country does not mean that you don't have a livelihood. As a global community, we have an opportunity to support these families to farm. They have the ability to farm. They have the ability to feed themselves still. They have the ability to have some form of dignity. Let's give them that dignity. Let's give them that ability to still know that they count for something. That is extremely important. So, but this has to translate into a long-term vision of how do they look at continued livelihood? How do they look at investments? What are those opportunities that exist for them to do investments in this sector? We are living in a time where climate change is becoming increasingly important. Let's make sure that people that are farming can actually have the resilience that they want in farming systems to be able to do a good job. So for me, it's what we do to support Ukraine, but let's not forget that what is happening in Ukraine from a food perspective has created a ripple effect of food challenges around the world. And the most affected of those are smallholder farmers, SMEs, people that are small and are excluded because they are small. If we can work and create means of collaborating and create means of ensuring that we reach these communities where they are and ensure that they have the access they need to be able to produce. Again, talking about dignity of human beings. At the food system, at the center of the food system, there has to be the issue of dignity and giving them dignity, but also it has to be economically viable. We have to ensure that they are participating in an economically viable environment. Give them the opportunity to participate in trade. Don't look, our world should not be about locking small fishers, small producers, small businesses out of business. What type of world is that? That's how exclusion becomes a major issue, and COVID-19 has shown us that we have these vulnerabilities in our system. That's why we talk about a broken food system, because we've allowed these things to go on forever. We need to step back and ask ourselves, what would it take to include more of these farmers? What would it take to include more of these fishers? What would it take to include more of these businesses and not bypass them and ensure that the value chains that they are participating in benefit the big guys as they benefit these communities that actually work in them. And that way we'll be able to reduce exclusion, marginalization, and ensure that we are in a better place and we can reduce poverty around the world. So for me, this crisis we are in does ask us and give us an opportunity to step back and ask ourselves how we can strengthen the viability of human beings around the world, because people are living in food systems that are not viable, and they themselves and their communities are ending up not being viable.
Paul, you unmute.
Yeah, it comes on mute the whole time. Very much focus on smallholder farmers and SMEs, ensuring that there is enough investment, and then being sure that we have the necessary seeds and fertilizers and materials that we need to be successful. Is there one idea, Agnes, that you can just mention coming out of the Food Summit that really captured your hearts and minds and said this is probably one of the biggest opportunities we can unlock if we can get to that?
I mean, today, the future we have in the food system is about climate change. If we can build the resilience of anybody that is in this sector, of people, but also of the food system itself, that has to be the bottom line, because there's no future without a stronger and resilient food system.
Yeah. And by the way, on the climate change as well, the area of resilience or adaptation is still significantly underinvested in many of the areas, as we are daily reminded watching television and seeing the disasters unfold in many of the countries. 50 million people more in acute food insecurity in Africa and in other places just because of climate change alone. I don't know if Sven is on the line. And if we still have Sven, because on my screen he fell off. Is Sven still there? It looks like we have lost him for a second.
If we have lost him, maybe I could talk about what resilience in the food system means.
Yeah, why don't you focus on resilience for a second and have, no problem, and have Osman, who's been very active in that area as well, perhaps comment on that as well. Go ahead, Agnes.
No, I thought about what you talked about earlier, the whole area of regeneration and how, when I look at what we are doing here in Africa, one of the things that probably made us stronger as a community was practicing, doing some of these practices in the past, regenerative, ensuring that regenerative agriculture was part of what we did. Today, we've lost it. We don't do it anymore. And as a result, we've lost so much soil carbon. We've lost the ability to produce, and yields have gone low. And unless we recapture this capability, which is extremely possible to do, not very difficult, we will not be able to have the right levels of soil carbon that are good for producing. It can't just be about fertilizers. Fertilizers would have to fall on a soil that has sufficient carbon to be able to move us forward. So that is one area that is extremely important.
Yeah.
But also there's the resilience of businesses that we need to think about, especially small businesses, and just ensuring that these small businesses can maintain their capital base by ensuring that there's funding instruments that do understand the nature of the environment they work in and can give them the push they need to survive in this landscape would be extremely important, especially because, again, climate change is taking away a lot of stuff that they've already done. So I'll stop there for now. There's so much more, but those
No,
two
that's
are
good.
very important.
Yeah, if I can just build on what Agnes has just shared with us, Paul. When we talk about resilience, we talk about government investment. We also need to talk about private sector investment. And I know that if Sven was here, he would talk about the role of ensuring that we are building capital access that includes government, private sector, as well as philanthropic resources to invest in the entire food system. Yes, we need to invest in regenerative agricultural practices as, first of all, as Agnes noted, as a part of resilience, but also as a preemptive humanitarian response. We don't wait until the crisis is over. During the period of time that we are addressing the challenges of the crisis, we also need to begin to invest in the work that is necessary to support the production of the food system. And yes, it is beyond what we traditionally do. Let's hand out seeds and tools. We need to ensure that the new tools that are coming online, whether they're better seeds or digital, and as well as those biological solutions, are available not just to affluent farmers, but to smallholder farmers across the globe to ensure their ability to maximize the opportunity that science and research brings to transforming agricultural production on the farm. But then outside that farm gate, we need to invest in the logistics that are necessary to support the transport of foods from farm to market, to support the warehousing of foods, the freezer systems, the storage systems, as well as retail and processing. Too often, goods leave the continent of Africa and come back on as processed goods at a higher price. And that value add is lost to the food system on the continent. And that's an opportunity for us to ensure that we are bringing new tools, new resources, new support that will increase the viability of the food system, as well as the resilience, as was stated, of all actors across the food system, from the farmer through the retailer.
Can we zoom in on two things that you both refer to? Is the need to get to regenerative agriculture, restoring soil health, protecting biodiversity, ensuring livelihoods for smallholder farmers. So if we look at regenerative agriculture, a healthier nutritional value of the food, etc., we see so many positives. We also see the elimination of enormous negatives that we now have and pay in externalities. Why is it so difficult to get to this at scale? Why do we see these experiments happening, but then not being able to expand to have a significant impact? What are some of the bigger barriers that we need to take away? We know the food system has become fairly political in itself, but we certainly have the money and the knowledge now to make these transformations. If you could have a magic wand and focus on 2 or 3 things that really have to change, what would they be?
Okay, if I was to go first, some of the big barriers you've already mentioned it. So one of the biggest barriers is that where the knowledge is needed, where things need to happen, is not necessarily where the knowledge is at and where the technology is at the right time. So you need both the knowledge and the technology in the right place at the right time. But there's an opportunity with so much digitization and use of data and ability to create services and solutions with digitization. We can ensure that this knowledge is getting to the people who need it the most and is diffusing very fast to be able to translate into the impact that we need. But let's also be clear that we've really figured out how to do things very easily, and that has carried the day. We have really doubled down on monoculture systems that are very focused on input heavy systems that really don't. Basically, we will take care of the input demand by putting on external inputs, but there are such things as what the soil needs, the soil already probably had, and we need to just help put it back. So if we can focus on ensuring that knowledge is becoming available to the communities that need it, that we are creating a business environment too. You know, there's nothing that's going to be viable and last long if we can't create a business environment around it. What are the opportunities for businesses to really figure out how to build a regenerative industry? What type of commodities fit best in that regenerative industry? And how do we create a market for it? Rather than go with a market of things that we already know and we feel comfortable with, which are probably 4 or 5 commodities that dominate the world. If we can allow more diversification, if we can allow more materials to come back into the ground that we have just removed food from, if we can pay more attention to what we are doing in terms of protecting soils and pay more attention to soil health management, we will be able to get more value, and we'll start being able to demonstrate that it's not a waste, that actually this knowledge is not a waste of time when we do invest in ensuring that the research that is being done to make knowledge available to farmers is actually working. So I really think that the biggest thing here is, let's take the knowledge out there and let's create a business environment that can translate what we are learning into opportunities that can actually sustain regenerative agriculture. We can get it started. We won't sustain it unless we create a business environment that takes advantage of the opportunities in the sector and provides services.
Yeah. And with 90% of the calories coming only from 15 crops worldwide, we certainly now have a system where we put most of our eggs in one basket, and it's just not working anymore, as you rightfully say. You, Earthrin, have also been in politics. You've led policy changes. You've been at the global scene with the World Food Program. A provocative question: is there too much politics in food? Most people would argue that, as we've seen with some of the restrictions that are coming in now and trade barriers, countries prohibiting export or keeping knowledge to themselves. What will it take when we deal with humanitarian issues at such scale to take that politics out of food?
The reality is, Paul, politics has always been in food. If you go back to the historic periods when you talk about the Greeks and the Romans and how food was traded, politics was part of how that food was traded. So a suggestion that we're going to take politics out of food is probably one that is I would say a simple non-starter, but the opportunity is to bring politics in the right way. Politics has supported the subsidies as well as the policies and regulations that has created the food system that we have today. What we need at every level, from the G7 to the multilateral organizations to the regional organizations and local governments, are support for policies that move us to a more diverse food system, that invest in the type of crop and transformative and agriculture that Agnes was just describing, as well as accompanied by private sector investment in those areas as well. Historically, private sector investment, number one, has been very limited in the agriculture and food space. But we are beginning to see more private sector investment in the agriculture and food space. But the communities that we're talking about, the work of smallholder farmers across the globe, the investments in food system processing and logistics in certain parts of the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, has been seen as too risky. So we need the policies that will de-risk the capital in a manner that will ensure that we can increase the amount of private sector capital that comes into the agricultural production system. And with that combination of policies that are supporting farmers and the development of the system, as well as investment and the capital, then we can begin to have the base that we need to support the change that is required.
Yeah. So how can we then, if you've talked about together about the political system and the frameworks and subsidies and policies that need to change. We've talked about the smallholder farmers that need to be in the center, the enormous role of the private sector to bring in more capital and more knowledge and technology. How can we really drive these broader systems changes that we need by getting all these stakeholders to work together? The silo approach that we've all too often seen in many of these industries in attacking the most burning planetary issues is only bringing us so far. So how can we create this broader mobilization? As Agnes knows from Africa, the famous proverb that alone you can go fast, but together you can go far. How do we actually cement that? Are there examples emerging that we should build on? Are there things we need to do to further stimulate?
Again, maybe I come in here. So the Food System Summit was a really good example of how we can mobilize the global community. You know yourself, Paul, that you worked with others to mobilize a huge part of the private sector and ensured that really the private sector showed up and really worked with everybody else to be very clear around some of the areas that provide opportunity for all of us to work together. That has to be probably the biggest opportunity of our times, because there's a lot of investments that go into the food sector from private sector. Probably is they are the biggest shareholder of what happens in the food sector. I mean, if I give you an example, and Earthlink has been at the center of this effort. We've seen that when we come together and collaborate the right way, we can actually make money. I mean, as businesses, make money, but also do good. And again, you also know this, probably I'm speaking from Rwanda, and probably there's no better place to see this, where both of you have participated in huge private sector-led investments. But at the core of that was at the center of that was the farmer, small farmers that are 0.3 of a hectare. They can't be smaller than that. But what you were both doing was to try to create ecosystems that would help deliver for these smallholder farmers, whether it is how Earthlink came in and offered a purchase, I don't know what they call it in economics, but the opportunity to purchase stuff ahead of production, so that this company could feel comfortable to be able to be part of building a factory in Rwanda that would transform lives for millions of farmers. I tell you today, every farmer in Rwanda goes to farm thinking they're going to provide that factory, supply that factory. The market is there. The sector is vibrant. Or whether it is what Unilever did, investing in tea, and ensuring that those smallholder farmers that come together as cooperatives actually do earn money that is tagged to the movement of the stock market. That's the first of its kind. The Rwandan farmer is actually tracking how the stock market goes, because they earn money. When it goes higher, they go higher, just like other investors. So that's what happens when businesses are very intentional about being inclusive in what they do, and ensuring that the bottom of the pyramid, the farmers that work in these sectors, do not be disadvantaged by engaging with the big businesses. Instead, they have the opportunity of benefiting from the huge investments that the businesses are able to make that they would never be able to make on their own.
Yeah. Before we go to the just transition, I want to stick to the stakeholders for a second. The financial market has an important role to play, but it's also often criticized of being either a spectator or a speculator. How can we ensure actually that enough of the funds are starting to move into this sector to form these broader partnerships for impact at scale? And Earthlink, you've been creative at the World Food Programme of setting up some of these partnerships and getting actually the funding in, but how could that be done at a global level to have true impact?
Paul, thank you. The reality is you're absolutely right. Let's talk about some of the successes. Agnes began to talk about AIF, which is a production facility that was created by DSM and the Rwandan government to make porridge that WFP committed to purchasing from the facility, allowing that facility to be a first of its kind, fully automated facility on the continent. In addition to that, during my period of time at WFP, we created the Farm to Market Alliance, which was a partnership between about 7 companies, including Cargill and Sven's company that's provided the Yara that provided the fertilizer. But what it also provided that was most important was a market. In the AIF example, what we provided was a market. And so bringing private sector capital in, we must ensure that there is a market for the investment in the products that are created that will support and de-risk the investment that private sector brings into these situations. Right now, I'm again back in Rwanda again, working with the Minister of Agriculture to address the issue of how do we scale up the commercial poultry industry. And we knew that we couldn't scale it without also addressing the issue of feed for poultry. And instead of doing that in a small scale manner, our commitment working with the minister is to create the first of its kind fully automated facility on the continent. Again, how do we do that? By ensuring that we can provide a market through our work with the poultry and feed merchants in the country to support the offtake from these facilities. So that market position, that market opportunity is quite critical to attracting the capital that is necessary to ensure the return on investment that is required from private sector investors. In addition, what we also need is to ensure that we build what we call blended capital stacks that include government and philanthropic capital, as well as private sector capital, acting as a de-risking mechanism for the investment of private sector into the agriculture sector, because we must move beyond programs. We must move into systems changes that are market driven, that are scalable and sustainable, as well as resilient.
So we have seen that because of the issues mainly affecting parts of the world or countries where financing might not be available, where debt capacity is difficult to get more into these countries, where risks might sometimes be too high. We've seen the Gavi, the Global Alliance on Vaccine, getting tens of billions of dollars to attack issues. We've seen the Global Alliance on Energy for People and Planet taking off with a $10 billion commitment, all meant to provide this catalytic funding to take first loss or risk, as you rightfully mentioned, Ertharin. But why, on the most important issue of humanity, the ability to at least have the dignity and respect of feeding everybody in this world a nutritious meal, why is it so difficult to create from the multilateral institutions or the philanthropic society institutions, if you want to, a significant fund that attacks the most burning issue that we have in the world? What is getting in the way of getting there?
I mean, there are so many things that probably get in our way in terms of getting there, and I'm sure Ertharin will have her take coming from the multilateral perspective. But when I look at what is going on in my part of the world, there's a lot of investments that are going into the sector, whether it is from the World Banks of this world and others. But I think the question has to be, why have these resources not contributing to an end in hunger? Why aren't they? Well, they are contributing, I must say, but why isn't the end nearer than we think? And I think, again, it goes, at the end of the day, it goes to a number of things. It goes to the fact that to address this area that is dominated by smallholder farmers, so many things have to be done at the same time. It's very important for farmers to have access to the inputs they need to increase yields, but it's also very important for them to have access to roads so that they can take their produce to the market. It's very important to have energy. The energy poverty in some parts of the world, like part of the world where I live in, is one of the highest in the world. And yet we know that there's no adding value to nearly anything unless we have energy. So, and we also know that if we don't add value, there's no creating the jobs. So it becomes a vicious cycle of one challenge leading to another that actually ends up making the whole issue look like it's too complex to handle. But here is the thing. We've agreed on $33 billion investments every year into food systems that could change, at least could answer the question of zero hunger and catalyze investments. But now, I don't think we are even raising $10 billion every year. But if we made sure that we raised $10 billion $30 billion until 2030, we could actually change this. If private sector came in and really found ways of working with the smallholders, found ways of working with SMEs, found ways of working with governments. We've seen that, at least in my institution, which is using philanthropic money, every dollar we invest, we see that local SMEs are investing $12. They can't be investing $12 because they are losing money. They're investing $12 because they are making money. So my frustration comes from the fact that it takes forever to get the type of investments you would want to unlock the type of businesses that Ethrin was talking about. And there has to be a very intentional way of making those resources available so that we can see transformative investments on the African continent. Otherwise, it will always be hidden middle, meaning SMEs and smallholder farmers, and that gets to define us for the next century. And yet we already know the answers. The answers is tangible investments that can actually change the perspective, and the number is 33 billion a year.
Yeah. So we have Sven back, and thanks, Sven, for connecting again. I know we're all used to these little hiccups now on Zoom, but glad to have you back. You've been a heavy investor in Africa with Yara. You've also been on the foreground of humanitarian aid when and where needed, like we saw in Kenya and other places. You've been a major force in putting these alliances together. What will it take to get more capital to move into these more vulnerable areas where we need to address with urgency our food systems?
Well, thanks, Paul, and really sorry for being disconnected. It's been some difficulties with the lines in here, but I'm glad to be here and part of this panel. I think it's important that we take this from the business side and the business opportunity, and then for Africa in particular, I believe there's a tremendous agricultural business opportunity. Look at probably between $40 and $50 billion being imported of food every year, and that's money leaving the continent that could be used for employment and processing and so on in Africa. And we've seen it so many times, and I've worked a lot both with you, Paul, and Agnes and Earthrin to demonstrate this, and we see that we can get really good results by focusing on regenerative agriculture, good practices, focus on the farmers, and just a case in point, when we work directly with farmers on an outreach with fertilizer, giving them the right agronomic advice, they were able not only to marginally increase their productivity, but we're talking about 3 times the yields for maize, for instance, in the first season. So that says something about the opportunity here. But then we need to not only focus on the crop yields, but it's the whole system, and that's what I've been following this rich discussion, and it's when we get the full end-to-end focus all the way from the input to the farmer, but to the market as well. We don't need any new technologies. We don't need any miracles on this. It's about full systems thinking. It's about breaking down the silos and the barriers there, and thinking differently around business than what we learned in business school, and open books, seeing how what we do on the input side affects the output side, but all of this has to be based on trust, and I guess that's what's shortest in supply at the moment is trust in order to drive it. But that's also the promising thing here, that maybe in all the catastrophe and all the difficulties we're faced with now, food is at the top of the agenda. We've seen what a weak food system is doing in terms of hunger, people dying. Let's now do the extra effort in order to drive this and drive it at scale. This needs to be resolved very, very soon. Well, you're on mute, Carl.
I've often said we should not compete on the future of humanity, and it's important that we have more of this collaborative partnership than this competitive partnership, and you're a great example of that. There is one area that we should perhaps put a little bit more focus on in this discussion, which is the just transition. At the end of the day, it is not only feeding the people within the planetary boundaries, but also ensuring that there is more equity, that we have an increasing inclusion, especially for the ones that are the most fragile with the current systems that we have. So for each of you, what does that just transition mean as we attack these bigger and broader changes in the food system that we talk about? Earthrin, you want to kick that off?
Well, I'll start by saying that from an environmental standpoint, it means having a food system that operates within our planetary boundaries, and that we do not increase land under cultivation to ensure that but yet we are increasing the productivity of the land that we're already operating for the system. We also need to ensure that it also meets the health needs of the entire population. As it's often said that we grow enough food, but to feed the world, we grow enough calories. We don't grow enough nutritious food. And that's what we've been talking about here today, is creating more opportunities for smallholder farmers to produce diverse crops that will support that diverse and nutritious diet that is necessary. 3.1 billion people can't afford a diverse diet today. And that number is increasing with the conflict in Ukraine and the increased cost of grains and commodities. And finally, we need to ensure that all actors across the food system receive an equitable financial return for their work on the food system efforts.
Yeah, well said. Equitable return, planetary boundaries, nutritious food. Agnes.
Thank you. When I look at just transitions, every time I hear the word just transition, it just for me means that we need to ensure that fishers, farmers, producers, people that work in the food system, for whom all their livelihoods depends on what they do, have a chance to a market. And I feel that the market has been, there's a real disconnect between local value chains, which is the markets they live in, and import value chains, and the CEO of Yara has just mentioned that. If you look, for example, here in Africa, a $50 billion import versus the fact that farmers don't have access to a market just means that the farmers who are producing cassava, which can be used for bread, which is as good a starch as wheat is, or as good a starch as maize is, don't have an opportunity or haven't seen the light of innovation in that commodity enough to allow it to be part of global value chains or other value chains that they can participate in and get value for their money. So really ensuring that we create these market opportunities that can create jobs. I live on the youngest continent in the world. And if we can't use the market opportunity that the agricultural sector, again, which holds 65% of Africa's population, that to use that opportunity to create jobs for all these young people that are coming out. This ends up being a global problem. This ends up fueling all sorts of conflicts that are not necessary. So for me, just transitions is making sure that everybody who wakes up to go to work can get value from the work that they do. And farmers are not getting that value.
Yeah. Sven, a company like Yara that is global and involved in many of the countries in the world, how do you build that concept of just transition actually in your business strategies that Agnes and Earthrin were talking about?
Yeah, I think really well said by both Earthrin and Agnes, and I fully support that. And I think we will be able to achieve this by paying the farmers to be the stewards of the soil. In the food system now, we've gotten exactly what we paid for, and that's paying the farmers for a kilo of crop, not how they produce, how they look after the soil. And there's a direct link between the health of the soil and how nutritious and healthy the food is. How is the carbon emissions? How do we reward food that is produced locally, transported fewer kilometers with less carbon footprint and so on? But by putting the farmer in the center and rewarding the farmers and putting a system in place that actually pay them for what they're doing, I think would shift this. And the good news is that now with the technology that we have, whether it's with smartphones for some, but even with regular phones, it's possible to get agronomic competence out to the farmers. So for me, just building on what Agnes and Earthrin said, let's put the farmer in the center and pay them for what they're doing, and I think that will help to get a just transition.
Yeah. One question that is coming in that we haven't talked, and we'll just take a few questions and only have one or two of you answer briefly for the rest of the time, but that we cover some of these things, is about protein, the protein disruption that is taking place. People saying we can produce 5-10 times cheaper the plant-based proteins than if we would have animal proteins, with all the avoidance of the negative environmental impacts. What can governments do to actually accelerate the move to healthier or less environmental impact proteins, if I may call it that way? Who wants to take that?
Okay, I'll jump in.
Nutritious, healthier, better tasting.
We need nutritious, healthy food of all kinds. To ensure that we have the just transition of the food system that we've just been talking about, we need to change how we manage livestock. We need to increase the amount of plant-based proteins and other alternative proteins in the food system. All of these are solutions that are part of the answer to providing access to more nutritious food at an affordable price for all people across the planet without detrimentally impacting our environment. The reality is that in the United States and Europe, you're absolutely right, Paul. We need to reduce the amount of animal proteins that we consume and increase the amount of alternative proteins that are affordable and available for consumption. In other parts of the world, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, we have challenges where babies don't get enough eggs. And so having access to more animal proteins is going to be part of the answer, but how we produce them will change to ensure that we are producing in ways that support that just transition of the food system.
Susie Cameron wrote this wonderful book, OMD, One Meal a Day, and still have a very balanced diet. You think government should do more to have the supply side, the demand side adjust and speed up that process? It probably differs by different parts of the world, I guess.
The only thing I was going to add to this is that protein and many other solutions in the food system need to really have a local context. Earthrin has just elaborated that. In my part of the world, I need governments to step up and not just create policies that would ensure that children have access to eggs, and create policies that would ensure that more people can invest, like Catherine is trying to do with the black soldier fly, so that so that food can become available to communities that need it quickly. So those policies are critical and are necessary, and they must be put in place. But more importantly, we need to up proteins, which is a different story than the rest of the world, where they need to scale back at producing proteins at basically at very affordable costs, which cost is paid by the environment now, we know very well. So I think for me, let's localize the solutions, whether it's carbohydrates or proteins. Let's understand that these solutions are going to have to best be defined by the local environment.
You know, we have had a rich discussion and covered many topics, but we started with the Ukraine, and I think probably it's appropriate to end our discussions with the Ukraine as well again, not only out of sympathy for the people of the Ukraine and our support and rallying behind them, which is really the purpose of this broadcast as well, but also to address a question to how do we ensure that not only that we deal with the short-term crises that are evolving as a result of this terrible invasion, but that we also continue to take the long-term actions that are needed to change the fundamental food system. And I'll ask Sven to give his reflections on that.
Yeah, so devastating in Ukraine, and all our sympathy for what is happening there. But we also have to keep in mind that the food crisis that we have now would have happened anyway. It accelerated it, but it would have happened because of the climate side, and it's all connected. It's not the either or solving the food crisis. It's about solving the food crisis and also the climate crisis that we have at the same time. And that can be done. The technologies are there. Regenerative agriculture will be able to do it, but it's about thinking holistically and not having a system like we had up until now that is so vulnerable that it breaks down quickly, and it makes food unaffordable now, perhaps unavailable later. And that's a joint effort between businesses, NGOs, and governments.
And it's probably important, Sven, to point out also that you do need to take short-term action now, like planting, or that you only have the benefits from in 6 or 9 months' time, when you can reap the crops that the seeds that you've been sowing. So we need to be careful that we respond to the short-term crisis that is there, but also take the right longer-term decisions, as you're saying, to continue to transform the food system at the speed and scale that is needed. If there is one message from each of you, limited to 1 minute, as a final message to leave this wonderful audience with, and what would that be?
I'll start. I'll start. The challenge that we're facing today is a high food price crisis. The issues that we've been discussing are what is necessary for us to avoid an availability crisis that we can also see looming without the investment in smallholder farmers, in production, the eliminations of export barriers that will ensure that we have a global food system that provides access to affordable, nutritious food, even during these tough times.
Thanks. Agnes?
Thank you. If there was one thing right now that is going over and over in my mind, is we need to help farmers, especially smallholder farmers, capture the true value of food. I mean, the full value of food from a productivity perspective, from a reduction of loss perspective. But we also, as a community, a global community, need to capture and account for the true cost of food, which we know is the environment that we are misusing when we don't factor that in. So if we do that, we get things back on track.
Thanks, Agnes. So, Sven, last word.
Yes, hope. I believe there is hope, and I do think it's possible to reduce the probability of an availability of food issue here, but it requires really swift action now. There's a lot of talk about it. It's high on the agendas, many places. let's turn that into real near-term action and get this done now. And then the good news is if we get that done, it's a huge positive influence on building the future long-term system, because that also requires some of the same actions on joint and collaboration in order to fix this. So, but it's upon all of us collectively now to really step up to the challenge and lead.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to end and thank this panel. We've talked about the complexities of the food system, the local nature of our food systems, not the simple aspects of a one-shoe-fits-all global solution. We've talked about consistently about some of these opportunities that are there that we need to address together, the opportunities of financing, of data, of technology, of getting the right partnerships together to solve these burning issues. And above all, I think we've talked about the need for leadership. I've often said that these are not issues of climate change or food security or inequality. Ultimately, these are the symptoms. The ultimate crisis, as many people would argue, is a crisis of greed, of selfishness, of apathy. So unless we put the people that we need to serve in the middle and drive ourselves to that higher level of moral leadership or purpose, if you want to, will we be able to address these challenges? At the end of the day, as was mentioned by the panel before, to many of the things we do have the solutions, and we know what needs to be done. So getting that willpower and that leadership to that higher level is probably our ultimate and highest challenge that we need to overcome. I thank you all for being with us. I thank you, panelists, to be part of this incredibly energizing panel, also a hopeful panel, and I look forward to the further discussions, but above all, the 24-hour Ukraine support that we're all rallying around, and that is the ultimate reason for us to be here with you today. Thank you, Chris, for what you've put together with Globescan, and we certainly look forward to supporting you as on the journey together as we move forward. Thank you all very much.